Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. In this episode, Dr. Ken Fraser joins me, and I'm very excited. And he will discuss Afghanistan and the pull out of Western troops, and of course, the recent event. Welcome, Dr. Ken Fraser. It's really great to have you back.
Well, it's really great to be here. It's a great honor to be able to contribute to these discussions. Marvelous activities you've been doing. Very pleased to be with you.
Thank you so much. Let's just dive into it. What's happening in Afghanistan?
Yes, Joe Biden he announced that it was going to be they were going to be leaving at the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the US. So September the 11th. There had been a deal made between the Taliban and the previous US administration under Donald Trump, which was quite detailed, staged withdrawal that was going to be completed by May the 31st. So Joe Biden had a choice either to go ahead with that deal or to tear it up and do something else. He could have basically done whatever he wanted. But he's chosen to just delay the pullout by several months from May to September. And they've gone ahead and done that. Now they've done what seems like a pretty smart tactical move in that they said it was going to be in September, but then most of them have already packed up and gone. They did it quite quickly, which I can understand why they would do that, because they wanted to get everybody out before they might come under attack from the resurgent Taliban, who was very predictable, I think, that the Taliban would take over. They themselves, the administration, had said that would probably be the outcome. Joe Biden was more confident. He was putting a lot of stake in the Afghan National Army, the defense and security forces there to fight back, basically, to hold their ground against the Taliban. And he seems to have been a little optimistic about how the morale was in the Afghan National Forces. There are a number of things that might account for the fact that what seems to have happened is they've just dissolved and gone back into the community, rather like what guerrilla forces do. So it remains to be seen whether they took any weapons or took any, whether they're planning to come back and start producing a counter-guerrilla force against the Taliban. That would be one possibility for the future, but that remains to be seen. There's some criticism of those forces for doing that, for giving up their positions so easily, when I think Joe Biden himself was hoping and expecting that they would put up more of a fight for it. But there's some reasons why you could say that was what they did. Sensibly, there were a lot of them on the books, but whether there were an equal number on the ground is another question. So now what's happened is the Taliban have swept through all the cities. I'm not sure if it's all the cities, but certainly most of the major urban centers. They've just taken city after city. There have been a few places where the Afghan special forces have held out, special operations forces have held out and have made a stand against the Taliban coming back. But sadly, they've been few and far between and probably pointless in the end. They might not have known what was happening in the rest of the country, I suppose. So a lot of courage displayed by them, sadly, would to no result in the long term. So far, it seems it's very difficult to know what's happening in the rest of the country. Apart from Kabul, most of the vision and most of what we're seeing by the Western press or the English-speaking media has been from Kabul. So it's very difficult to know what's happening in the rest of the country. But the Taliban have been making all the right noises about women's rights, about general people's rights, about not. They've said they won't be taking revenge on people who've worked with the Western forces there. You know, whether they're just talking about that, or whether they actually genuinely intend to have an attempt at reconciliation with those people, it just remains to be seen. We don't know whether they're sincere or not.
What is your feeling about this? That, you know, maybe we just have to give them more credit, the Taliban, and maybe they will be very cautious and will be actually help rebuild Afghanistan that is struggling, you know, now for decades, you know, well, more for decades, I think.
More like half a century, really.
Yeah.
They've been the Russians invaded in 1978 or 9, and they've been pretty much constantly at war since then, which runs on to 40 years of constant war of one kind or another. War and occupation, you might say. So there's a kind of a little bit of a difference between war and occupation, which perhaps we can talk about a bit later. But as far as giving the Taliban credit, well, it just remains to be seen. The original founder and leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, he died of tuberculosis back in 2015. Then they had another leader who was killed in a drone strike by the Americans in Pakistan, I believe. And now the current leader is, who knows? I mean, I personally don't know that much about him. But there's no particular reason to say they're not going to help, as you say, help to reestablish and rebuild the country after these long decades of war. It's a very difficult thing to do because many people are traumatized by the things they've seen and done. The economy won't be going very well apart from the heroin trade, although Afghanistan does have quite a lot of natural resources. So if they can attract investment, they might be able to start to build up. As a general rule, new governments, new regimes, I should say, the very first thing they're occupied with is to legitimize their own rule. What they want to do, what they want is recognition from the international community of states, and they also want recognition from their own community. They want the people there to accept their rule. So that's something that might give us some hope, because in order to, you can make people bow to your rule by killing lots of them and torturing them and depriving them of the necessities of life and oppressing them one way or another. That's one way. It's a relatively unsustainable way, really. A better way is to provide them with the public goods that governments undertake to provide. Certainly under Islamic law, there's a responsibility on the government to look after the people, a strong one, and there are provisions for resistance of governments that don't fulfill their duties in terms of looking after the people. As I say, there doesn't appear to be much evidence. It's very difficult to know what's happening in the countryside, but they are saying they're not going to be punishing people who worked with the occupying forces, or translators, drivers, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have been connected in one way or another with the occupation. So, there is a potential there for a horrendous bloodbath. But at the moment, it doesn't appear to be happening. But it's early days yet, so we really don't know. So to give them some credit, well, we can't really give them any credit for things that haven't happened yet. It remains to be seen. We would certainly have to credit them with a canny and persistent strategy that's involved a long time of patient training and attracting support from other great powers, China and Pakistan. Well, it'd be wrong impression to say that Pakistan supports the Taliban, but Pakistan's a very fragmented state. There are different power centers there, and some of them have certainly been supporting the Taliban. Go on.
What do you think is the support, within the broad society in Afghanistan, for the Taliban? It also seems to be hard to actually discern how broad this support is. You know,
Yes.
can you say something about this?
Well, again, it's extremely difficult to say because while the occupation was there, many people in the countryside in particular were in a position where the Americans or the occupying forces, including Australians, would, and including NATO forces, but mostly Americans, and they would come during the day and extract promises and statements of, try to build support with the people in the villages. But then at night time, the Taliban would come along and they would declare their support for them during the nights. And they had a terrible time of, constantly on a knife edge with people pointing guns at them and trying to, and they sensibly would be just saying whatever they felt they needed to say at the time to stay alive. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to gauge public opinion in those circumstances. Nobody goes around doing opinion polls when there's a war going on. So, but I mean, surveys in a lot of the Muslim world come back with quite strong support for Sharia and Islamic practices in terms of government. Islam doesn't have as a general rule, doesn't have a very strong distinction between politics and religion. They kind of go together. So, and a lot of people express support, but they don't. But Sharia it's a kind of loose, like any other foundational text. The Hadith and the Quran they can be interpreted in many different ways. Some people, even the interpretation of them is contested, because some people say that you're not allowed to interpret them. They say it's the word of God or the word of the Prophet, and that you can't interpret it. You have to just take it at face value. Others say, well, no, there is this tradition of ijtihad, of interpretation of the the precepts that Sharia runs on. And in fact, Sharia, depending on how you interpret it, mostly in the West, when you say Sharia, people say Sharia law. Well, and what they're really referring to is the very harsh punishments for criminal offences, including blasphemy and including adultery and things that we wouldn't normally in the West. In the democratic West, we probably wouldn't classify them as crimes at all. They'd be personal matters. And they have what's called the hudud punishments for, like, thieves get their hands cut off, and people can be executed for various crimes that the English-speaking democracies would not consider to be crimes. Blasphemy, homosexuality, other things that dissent, but the point is that it all depends on how you interpret what Sharia is. Mm-hmm. Most people in the West, they say Sharia law, and what they mean is those harsh punishments. But Sharia is much more than that. Sharia is a whole way of life. It's a whole system of organizing governments and populations. And it can be variously interpreted and variously enforced. So measuring, even if you were to be able to get in and take an opinion poll of the population of Afghanistan regarding Sharia, you might find them saying, yes, I support Sharia being as a system of government, but that wouldn't actually tell you very much about what they really would like to see. Mm. So there are plenty of women, for example, who support Sharia, but they reject that they need to be wearing head coverings or certainly full body coverings. That's not mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith or the other law components of Sharia. It doesn't say women have to be covered up completely. It says women and men should dress modestly, but you can interpret, again, everything's open to interpretation.
That is very interesting. Let's just go back quickly what you have said, that the previous administration had done a deal with the Taliban. And so you will also say that, the Taliban didn't conquer, in this sense, Afghanistan militarily speaking. In other words, due to this deal, it was quite clear that they will take over And therefore, the Afghanistan military just decided basically, to step back and just let them pull into it, because it was just so quickly and it was almost impossible. And do you think, given the military power of the Afghan government, if there would have been an actual clash between the two groups, would have had the Taliban any chance, militarily speaking, against the Afghan government?
Well, you have to then come back to the question of morale, which is a key component of any military operation or military culture. You can have all the weapons in the world and all the training and all the money, everything you need to have, but if people haven't got the will to fight, if they are not on the side, if they're not committed to the cause that they're fighting for, then why would they, all the gear won't help in that case. Now, having said that, and I know Joe Biden's been saying things about, why should we protect the state when their own armed forces are not willing to fight for their own existence. It's a little bit harsh. Like I see where he's coming from. Say, well, if they're not willing to fight for it, why would the US want to stay around for another several decades, possibly, if the people there themselves are not willing to fight for it? That's a little bit, should be qualified at least, because many of those soldiers hadn't been paid for a long time. Many of the soldiers didn't even exist. There was on paper, there was something over 300,000 personnel, like combatants, but many of them didn't even exist. They call them ghost soldiers. So the higher up people were drawing their salaries, but they weren't paying anybody. They weren't actually recruiting people to do that. Similarly, with the equipment, they were given lots and lots of high-tech, very good equipment, good gear by the Americans, but again, it was being sold on the black market. So the corruption of the government has a couple of effects. One effect is that you're not going to fight without ammunition. If all your ammunition's been sold on the black market, you can't fight, can you? So I wouldn't like to say anything too definitive about the extent of that, but it certainly is a factor. But the other factor is, if you're on the front line, no matter what sort of gear you've got, and then you discover that your president has disappeared overseas, and that the people the government you're supposed to be fighting for is corrupt and obviously not having really the interests of the people in mind, but more their own interests in making as much money out of being in government as they can. It's like the question becomes, well, why would you fight for a government that's not even trying to look after the needs of the people? Whereas the Taliban are coming and saying they've got a very firm agenda. They know exactly what they're doing. They're predictable. It remains to be seen whether they'll be terribly harsh with public executions and harsh punishments and that sort of thing. If that happens, that'll probably turn the population off them. But there is a possibility, let's hope, that they've become more moderate in the intervening years since they were last in power. We can hope that. I don't know what evidence there is. But you can certainly see, you might say, well, if they're not, about the national army, I mean, to say, well, if they're not willing to fight for their own country, why would we be willing to fight for them? But then the next question is, well, why would they be wanting to fight for a government that's so corrupt and obviously doesn't have their interests at heart?
So bottom line, you would say that the responsible bears as much the Afghan government as the Western government in a sense. But, and this, I think it's an important question. I'm very curious what you think about this. Would you call this Afghanistan, started 2001, would you call it a Western policy disaster when you look at the very recent events?
Well, it's hard to escape that conclusion. It's hard also to look at the recent events in isolation from the whole thing that's been unfolding over 20 years, as you say. They began specifically disavowing nation building or state building. The US, George W. Bush specifically said, we're not going to nation build. They didn't initially send an occupation force. Mostly it was special forces, special operations forces, and air power that they used to rout the Taliban. And of course, Osama bin Laden, they are not Afghan. The Al-Qaeda are not Afghan, they're Arabs, mostly, nearly all of them was from Saudi Arabia, and others from all over the Arab world. And they were sometimes resented by the people that they were among. They were saying, well, what are these Arabs doing in our country? So they achieved their ends in terms of routing the Al-Qaeda, even though they didn't capture Osama bin Laden until a long time later, 10 years later. So I would and then they found themselves drawn in further and further into occupation of Afghanistan, and then by necessity they found themselves having to support a government which they were hoping that the government would take over responsibility for the country and that they would be able to withdraw. This is an almost impossible thing to do. It's very difficult. The two times that it has worked have been with Japan and Germany after the Second World War. Well, they were completely shattered. They were under occupation. In some ways, they still are. They're still very large American forces in both of those countries. The Americans wrote a constitution for both of those, and it worked over time. They spent an awful lot of money with the Marshall Plan, but they've spent more than that in Afghanistan, but it hasn't worked there. So it's interesting it would be an interesting project to examine the differences. Is it a policy disaster? Well, it might be that you can say that the withdrawal has been a policy disaster, but I wouldn't say that. From a strictly American point of view, strictly from the US's point of view, it's a good move. It's undoubtedly a good move. Why would they be wasting huge amounts of money and their lives of their soldiers to run this government prop up this government on the other side of the world that doesn't have any strategic interest for them? Now, whether that's a good decision, it's a disaster for the people of Afghanistan is another question again. And so as far as a policy disaster for the US, the withdrawal doesn't look like that to me, except possibly in terms of their credibility for future operations. But the initial invasion actually doesn't seem like a disaster either, but the problem was that they were drawn in to occupation and to propping up a corrupt and unpopular government for many years. That's the disaster. The disaster had already happened. Nothing that Joe Biden was going to do would prevent what has had already happened in the past. Now, there are many arguments to be had that they should have stayed there. They didn't have all that many people there. People did have rights. Women were able to participate in public life. Girls were being educated. Media was freer. There was free speech and free media. There was music and dancing. So you could say, well, it wasn't that expensive for the Americans. It had been in the past. But now to be going on with it, actually, they weren't spending all that much money as compared to their overall military budget, perhaps. So there are arguments, there are valid, good arguments to say, well, they should not have withdrawn. But they're arguments about what's good for Afghanistan. They're not arguments about what's good for the US. For the US itself on its own, it's undoubtedly the best move. Except, as I say, the problem, and you're about to ask me, I think, the problem for the US is their international reputation. So next time they say we're going to intervene in some country, or they threaten to do something to stop a genocide happening somewhere or some other horrendous disaster, people are going to say, oh yes, well, they know now. All we have to do is wait them out. This is the great thing about guerrilla war against occupations, insurgencies, is that they don't have to win. They just have to not lose. And so you asked before about whether the Taliban has conquered Afghanistan, and the answer has to be yes, even though there wasn't much fighting involved. There was some, but just now. but they were well prepared. They knew exactly what they were going to do when the Americans left. They planned to come in the north, where most of the resistance to the Taliban is in the north. So they started there. They were deliberately attacking two places at once, often, so that the Afghan forces didn't have enough of the special operations forces to be in two places at once. The Taliban did. It's very clever. So their strategy has been very effective. The Art of War, written by Sun Tzu in China, the Bible of strategists everywhere, says that the greatest excellence of strategy is to win without fighting. And I think you can say they've achieved that they've managed to maneuver themselves into a position where they didn't have to do all that much fighting. Not saying there was no fighting, there was, but mostly it was pretty much a walkover. And that is the result of good strategy on their part, among other factors. But certainly they deserve credit for that. They're not my favorite bunch of people, that's for sure. Remains to be seen whether they can redeem themselves and their reputation in the eyes of the international community. But they'd have to go a long way to do that, because they had an absolutely horrendous reputation before that.
So, to wrap up, I could say you remain, somewhat, optimistic for the future, given the recent events that seemed just crazy. Yeah.
Well, it all happened very much faster than what the Americans were hoping it would. And they reached Kabul much faster than the Americans were planning for. Not only the Americans, my own country, Australia's had to sort of mobilize emergency flights to get people out, which they were planning to do, but it was much faster. As far as optimism is concerned, it's not so much that I'm optimistic as that I'm willing to keep an open mind about it. I don't really know what's going to happen. If they start, the eyes of the world will be on them, that's for sure. There are plenty of other regimes in the world who are horrendous as far as their, particularly their legal systems are concerned. In Saudi Arabia, there are regular public executions. Women are not allowed to drive, or they might have only just recently been allowed to drive. They can't go out without a male member of the family, et cetera, et cetera. There are plenty of other places which you would say are harsh and oppressive regimes. So optimism's a bit, I don't know that I'd say that I'm optimistic, but I would say that I'm willing to keep an open mind about it. But the Taliban would have to do a lot to convince me, or anybody else for that matter, that they have changed fundamentally. They're still talking about, they're saying we'll respect women's rights as long as they conform with Sharia. That they've allowed, UNICEF has negotiated with the Taliban over quite some time to be able to set up schools for girls and that sort of thing. So that they probably wouldn't have been able to negotiate that with when Mullah Omar was in charge. So there are some signs, but again, it's just far too soon to say.
Dr. Ken Fraser, it's been great to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
It's a great honor and a pleasure. Thank you, Yannick.
Dr. Ken Fraser.